Welcome to PR Talk, sponsored by the PRSA of Oregon. This is your host, Amy Rosenberg, founder of Veracity and author of A Modern Guide to Public Relations. Help other people find our podcast by subscribing, rating, giving us a review, or sharing on social media. Thanks for tuning in.
And now, please welcome Rotarian Robert Kraft.
Thank you, Reed. So this program is brought to you by the Oregon Ethics and Business Committee, and we have always pondered the true meaning of the word ethics. There are words that attempt to describe it, but it's one of those concepts where you know it when you see it. Implementing ethics in the workplace starts with defining policy, and technology has radically altered the current business landscape. Today's program focuses on how tech policy affects society. So let's get started. Amy Rosenberg is founder and president of Veracity, a PR firm established in 2008, specializing in thought leadership, corporate responsibility, and SEO PR. Before Veracity, Amy was recruited away from management at Guard Communications to sell and market a multifamily real estate development in Portland. And Amy has hosted more than 100 episodes of her podcast, PR Talk, and released her first book, A Modern Guide to Public Relations, this year. Matt Perault is the director of the Center on Technology Policy at University of North Carolina, and previously led Duke University's Center on Science and Technology Policy. Previously, Matt served as Facebook's head of global policy development, addressing issues such as human rights, antitrust, surveillance, and the Snowden disclosures. Before that, Matt was counsel at the Congressional Oversight Panel created during the financial crisis of 2008 to oversee the U.S. Treasury's stabilization of the financial system. Matt hosts the TBD podcast, Technology by Design, and routinely writes for Slate magazine. Without further ado, Amy Rosenberg and Matt Perault.
Hi, everyone. I was muted. Thank you for having us. I'm just going to kick it to Matt in a second, but I just want to say that if anybody has any questions along the way, please feel free to type those in the chat and we'll try and get those answered. And then you might have so many questions, we might actually break early to answer those. But Matt, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we launched the Rotary call today by talking about Facebook and Instagram. And it sounds like everybody looked into that and everybody possibly knows what's going on there. But maybe you can just give us a rundown on what is happening currently, since I think it's been about a week since that news broke, and what you think about it, especially since you worked at Facebook for 8 years.
I didn't even know there was anything happening recently. There's Facebook news. It's been a big week for Facebook. So I think several weeks ago, actually, this started with a series of Wall Street Journal article pieces called the Facebook Files that were based on whistleblower leaks of internal research documents at Facebook. And then the Wall Street Journal wrote a series of pieces about various different components of the research. After those stories hit, there was one hearing that was with someone from the privacy team at Facebook, and then a subsequent hearing, I think 2 weeks ago, with the person who runs the safety program at Facebook. And then this past week, Frances Hogan, the whistleblower who had provided the documents to the Wall Street Journal, testified. And so there is a lot of focus right now on regulatory issues in the tech space. And the question, I think, right now is there going to be new regulation that will address some of the issues that came to light in the Facebook files? I think for a variety of reasons, actually, legislation is very unlikely, and it's even more unlikely that there would be legislation that either addresses these problems or that actually harms Facebook.
So first, let's talk a little bit about the problems to just kind of give people a rundown, or the alleged problems, possibly we would say.
Yeah.
And also, why do you think legislation is unlikely? Just curious about that.
Yeah. Well, so I'd love to hear from other people about what they think the problem is. I think there's a lot of loud voices talking about the problem, and it's not clear to me that that's actually matches up exactly to the issues, to the research that was disclosed in the slides that the Wall Street Journal published. That research showed that a percentage of people who are on Instagram, particularly teenage girls, report after their Instagram usage that they feel worse. The interesting thing I think about the slides is that when I first heard that news and saw the Wall Street Journal piece, I thought, okay, 20% is a sizable number. I think we would prefer, that a smaller percentage than 20% report feeling worse after their use of Instagram. But I wondered, what about the 80%? What are the other experiences that people are having on the Instagram platform? And the data in the slides showed that about 41% of people reported no effect, so not feeling better or worse after Instagram usage, and about 41% reported feeling either much better or somewhat better after using Instagram. And so I think the data, which I think it should be clear is like internal survey data done by Facebook, it doesn't show causal relationships. I think it is like helpful data for starting a conversation, but it's not definitive data by any means. And not definitive in any direction. Like, I don't think it's conclusive evidence of harm. I don't think it's conclusive evidence that there's no problem. But it does show this mixed effect that people are having a negative experience on the platform, but then twice as many people are having a positive effect on the platform. Those were the kinds of issues that I think they make for difficult conversations in a congressional hearing. I think congressional hearings are not known for their depth. You have senators or representatives trying to hammer home points. You have companies trying to be evasive and without perjuring themselves. And they're not, I don't think, for really wrestling with some of the challenging issues associated with this. Those are issues that I loved in my time at Facebook, not knowing that some number of people were having a bad experience with the platform, or that it was making body image issues worse, or making the challenges of being a young person or a young woman in America more difficult. But the thing that I liked was trying to figure out, well, we have this product where there are real trade-offs. There are pros and cons to how this product functions in the world. Are there things that we can do that will address some of the downsides while preserving the benefits? And then when you work on a policy team in a tech company, kind of the additional gloss is not just about product improvements, but also about what would the right policy landscape be. So like, what would the regulation look like that would actually address some of the harms of the product without hopefully harming the good things, without making the product worse for the people who actually have a positive experience in the product. I think that's very difficult to do in practice, very, very difficult to do. And so despite the kind of rhetoric around the Wall Street Journal pieces, which I should say were like, I think, very excellent journalism. Jeff Horowitz, who I think was involved in all the pieces. I don't think he was the sole writer of all of them. But he's someone who I've gotten to know in the last couple of years. I think he's a really extraordinary reporter. He did an incredibly good job with this. And there's a reason that people who are taking information out of tech companies take it to Jeff. He's a very strong reporter. But I think the rhetoric around the stories is kind of out of line with the thinking about the costs and benefits of the platform themselves, and then figuring out the right regulatory model.
And why do you think that legislation won't occur? And then what about just some kind of oversight? Do you think that some more oversight might need to happen? And you might be good to talk about that because you did work on the Congressional Oversight Committee, which oversaw the financial crisis. So you might kind of even be able to draw some parallels between the two, possibly.
Yeah, so I think legislation is unlikely for a bunch of political reasons. So it's difficult in the current environment to get any legislation through. There's always kind of political challenges in moving something along. I think it was the opening skit on Saturday Night Live this weekend was the Facebook hearing, and one of the kind of lead jokes was about the likelihood that this issue would get prioritized relative to others on the legislative calendar. So is it right now we have a COVID crisis, we have infrastructure issues, we have legislation pending to reform the election process, we have issues in Afghanistan. Is it likely that kids on Instagram is going to get prioritized legislatively above those other issues? I think probably not. It's also difficult to get legislation passed because of legal barriers. So if Congress wanted to regulate algorithmic distribution of information on Instagram, for instance, that would be difficult to do because of the First Amendment. So tech companies they have First Amendment protection, which means the government cannot dictate speech on tech platforms. And then they also have their own ability, because of the First Amendment, to dictate the terms of service that are on their platforms. So they have kind of broad First Amendment freedom to be free from the government in terms of the government's interference with their terms, and then to set their terms as they want to and enforce them for their users. So I think any legislation would probably run into legal challenges as well. I also think it's really unlikely that any of the legislation that would be introduced would specifically harm Facebook and Instagram relative to competitors to Facebook and Instagram. So policymakers talk all the time about wanting to do things to hold tech accountable, but any tech reform that increases compliance costs, so anything that means that those businesses have to hire more attorneys to review their products, that have to hire bigger and bigger compliance teams to deal with legislation, are likely good for large companies that have a lot of resources that can hire more people to deal with compliance costs. That means that legislation that might be designed to curb conduct by Facebook and Google will actually, I think, benefit them relative to their competitors.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of big versus little in terms of companies, you could also look at that as big versus small political campaigns. And you had a good example last time we spoke about some of this misinformation that does occur online. If we are trying to regulate misinformation so much that sometimes it's not good for the little guys. So can you talk about that and how it relates possibly to the First Amendment?
Yeah. So right after I left Facebook in October. In November, Twitter decided to turn off all political advertising. This is of 2019, so a year before the presidential election. At the time, a colleague, a friend of mine, he's now a colleague, he was at UNC, he and I wrote a piece about Twitter's decision to ban all political advertising. And the core claim that we made was that it was likely to harm challengers more than incumbents. So upstart campaigns rely heavily on social media advertising because it's relatively cheap, because they can reach targeted users easily. It's much easier to run. You can run a $5 ad campaign on Facebook. You can't buy a $5 spot on TV, as you know probably better than I do. And so social media is competitive in the advertising world, not because or just because big tech companies are like stealing the advertising revenue of other sectors, but because it's competitive advertising that's high quality and low cost. And so that's good for campaigns that don't have significant resources. So we wrote that piece in November 2019. And then as the election approached, other platforms followed Twitter's lead. So Facebook, for instance, decided to turn off political advertising in the last week before the election. And a colleague and I co-authored a paper that we published this past spring about the impact of those ad bans. And what we actually found was that they probably had little effect on misinformation, because misinformation spreads through organic content, probably more so than paid. So organic content is content that's unpaid. Just if you decide to go on Facebook and post something, you can use that to spread misinformation. More misinformation spreads on tech platforms through organic content than paid. And often paid advertising is actually used to correct organically spread misinformation. So the kind of quintessential example is that Donald Trump actually doesn't need political advertising to get his message out to voters. He had huge followings on Facebook and Twitter. He could tweet or post on Facebook in an unpaid way, and he could tweet misinformation. People would then run ads to combat that misinformation. And when Facebook has turned off political advertising, they're unable to do that. So we didn't think it had much impact on misinformation. We thought it would harm poorer campaigns. We found that it harmed poorer campaigns relative to wealthier ones. And that because of how Democrats use social media, that it probably also likely hurt Democrats more than Republicans. So this change that platforms had made, which I think was done originally, the idea was sort of that it would combat things like President Trump-driven misinformation. We found that it instead probably harmed poorer campaigns and Democratic campaigns over wealthier and Republican ones.
Okay. And so can you talk about your time at Facebook? I mean, you handled a lot of issues there and possibly what you learned there. And in terms of, kind of switching over to academia and why you did that and what some parallels that you can draw between the two.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know. It's hard to sort of summarize my experience there briefly, but I learned a lot, I think, about trying to be a practitioner in the world. So I had come, as you said, I think 1 or 2 questions ago, I had worked previously at the Congressional Oversight Panel, and we were doing oversight work. We weren't practitioners. We were the panel, actually, oddly, given her stance on tech and mine, was chaired by Elizabeth Warren. And so our job was to review the Treasury Department's practices during the financial crisis and to assess on behalf of the American people how they were performing and what they could do better. And we would be at these tables doing these interviews with people who were working at the Treasury Department at the time. And I was in the position of being a critic. So every single oversight panel, an oversight panel does not do a good job when it says, great job, everything's doing fine, everyone's doing fine. An oversight panel is designed to be a critiquing institution, to find the fault in or the gaps in what an institution is doing. And so all of our reports were critical in some form of what the Treasury Department was doing. And I really empathized, I think, with the people on the other side of the table, with the people at the Treasury Department, because they were in an incredibly challenging position, an enormous amount of pressure. They were working very long days to try to make the financial crisis activity of the federal government good for taxpayers, to create the right incentives for businesses to do the right things, to actually return money that the taxpayers had spent in bailouts and financial crisis programs. They were trying to return money to American taxpayers, and I liked that. I admired that work. And so when I went to Facebook, I was not in the critiquing position. I was working for a company. That put a product out in the world, and my job was to think about how we could make that product better, how we could try to make sure that it provided a beneficial experience to as many people as possible. And that when we became aware of things that were problematic about the product, that we took that seriously and tried to improve things. And then also trying to communicate that with government. So when you sit on a public policy team, your job is understanding the product, working with the product teams to hopefully improve the product, but then also being a liaison between the company and policymakers all over the world. And I found that component of the work to be very fulfilling, to try to think through what are policy tools that would actually address some of the harms that people see on tech platforms, but not do it in a problematic way.
And what are some of the policy reforms that could be enacted now to help the world with the issues that possibly could be happening with technology today?
Yeah, and I want to respond to one comment in the chat. Martin says, please stop calling it misinformation. They're saying it's misinformation versus deception. I think misinformation or disinformation are sort of the terms that are used most commonly in the academic literature. So I don't actually necessarily have a preference on what the thing is called, but in the academic literature, it's typically either misinformation or disinformation. So the policy. So I think I'm generally opposed to policy solutions that would increase compliance costs, because I think that those are efforts that are likely to be taken in the name of trying to hurt Facebook and Google, and they will hurt their competitors. So it's actually really interesting to see the trajectory of the narrative around GDPR in Europe, which is Europe's privacy legislation, which I think was implemented maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And at the time, the idea was really this is returning rights to the people, shifting power from big tech companies to people and giving them more rights over their information. And that was the dominant narrative for a long period of time. And just in the last couple of weeks, I think this was even part of the Facebook hearings in the last couple of weeks, people have started to acknowledge that actually what GDPR has done is increase compliance costs for any company that wants to operate in Europe. That's not that big a problem for a company like Facebook or Google. Those companies spend a lot of money on GDPR compliance, but they can afford to. They can put 500 lawyers on a GDPR compliance task. They have the kind of employee base to be able to do that. Smaller companies, like a company like Reddit, might not be able to do that. And my understanding at the time GDPR came into force was that the Los Angeles Times no longer made its service available in Europe because they were worried about compliance risk. And that's a company as sizable as the Los Angeles Times. No longer did Europeans have access to the Los Angeles Times because of GDPR risk. So that development is actually a positive one from a market position standpoint for a company like Facebook or a company like Google. And those are the kinds of regulatory proposals that I think are preferable to avoid. Like, I think Section 230, for instance, is good for competition, actually, because it makes it easier for a range of different types of companies to host. Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah. Well, I just want to make sure you tell people what Section 230 is specifically. And we might not even know what GDPR is, but I don't know that we need to get totally into that.
Yeah. So the key thing on GDPR is just that it's Europe's privacy initiative. I think it stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And it has been kind of viewed generally as the kind of world leading effort to regulate privacy. So, often when you see it mentioned, you see people say the US doesn't have a federal privacy law. Europe, we need to be more like Europe. Europe has strong privacy protections. That's coming from GDPR. Section 230 is a provision from a 1996 law that allows online services to host content without being held liable for what users say. So if someone says something that's defamatory, for instance, on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or Snap or Reddit, you can file a case against the individual person for defamation, but you can't hold Facebook liable for something that Facebook said. That law, the way that law is often talked about as if it is a sort of uniquely beneficial thing for large tech companies. I think if it were reformed or repealed, and there's a lot of conversation about it being repealed, what would actually likely happen is that large companies would probably be able to afford the costs associated with repeal, and smaller companies wouldn't. So a company like Reddit, at one point I was like trying to understand the employee numbers at all these different companies. Facebook, I think, is 60,000. Google is twice that. Microsoft, I think, is maybe twice Google's size. Reddit has 350 million users, and they recently doubled their employee base from 750 to 1,500. So they're just a different size company, and Reddit relies right now for its content moderation practices. It relies actually on community moderators. So it relies on basically the site to help to police itself. That they wouldn't be able to do that if Section 230 were repealed. So Section 230 really permits like a diverse set of content moderation approaches.
Okay. And so where does ethics come into play when, I know you don't work a lot on ethics, you're in academia kind of reviewing all of this and teaching your students about this. But when we last spoke, you had an interesting point that you teach your students about, to think about, if you really want to work on a mission driven organization, that it might not be found in nonprofits. It might not be found in academia. It actually might be at Facebook or a bigger company.
Right. Yeah. So I think people think that companies are all about money and not at all about mission. And they think that nonprofits or academia are all about mission and not about money. And I just think those lines are blurrier. I think there are nonprofits that are very mission driven that aren't focused on money that would be required to keep the lights on. And there are companies that are exclusively focused on money. But and this is very contrary to the current narrative around Facebook. My experience, I was not part of very many or any, maybe like I literally, when I think about it, I can't remember conversations that where the dynamic of the conversation was, we'd like to do this because it would be good for the planet, but let's not do it because not doing it is good for our bottom line. Different people have different experiences. So but you're
referencing your experience in academia now, or
no? I was responsible. Sorry, that was my experience at Facebook. Was that I was never I've been part of lots of conversations, to be clear, in academia about money as the driving force to make certain decisions. I don't think there are many college campuses that would be open right now if all they cared about was mission, as opposed to money. So I've been part of lots of conversations that are like financially driven in academia. and I'm sure that I was at Facebook as well, but they don't really come to mind. And again, like I don't dispute, Frances Hogan, the whistleblower, her testimony, I think, was very much to the contrary. So her experience, I think, was that she felt like Facebook was repeatedly had a fork in the road, make a decision that's good for the world or make a decision that's good for Facebook's financial bottom line. And that Facebook was repeatedly making a decision that was good for its bottom line and harmful for the world. And that may have been her experience. That wasn't mine, at least sitting where I sat within the company. The orientation for us usually was, can we figure out how to address some concern? And those questions were really difficult, and we made mistakes. And I'm not saying everything that we did was positive, but I really did feel like it was motivated by a desire to do good. On your broader question about ethics, I'd love if people would weigh in with different perspectives or questions about this, because I assume there are a lot of people who disagree with me about it. I have been skeptical of ethics, and I've been skeptical of it not because I think that people shouldn't be ethical, but because for me, the question I'm sort of obsessed with is like, what are the frameworks for decision making that help you to reach better decisions? And at least for me, and again, I think a lot of people have different experiences. I just don't encounter that many decisions where it's like you could do the thing that's clearly good, like moral and just and right, or you could do the thing that's evil and bad. Now you have to have the fortitude to do the good thing. Those just are not the kinds of decisions that I feel like I have typically faced, or that certainly were the hardest kinds of decisions that I had at Facebook. And so in my conversations, particularly in academia around ethics, I feel like they have raised many questions. What do you do when people don't feel in control of their information and they want to exercise better control over their information? That's an important, hard question. Or what do we do in a world where we're moving more toward automation and artificial intelligence, and that might displace labor, and that's something that we should be conscious of? Those are good, hard, important questions. But my focus is really like, how can we make stronger decisions? And that's less about asking hard questions and more about coming up with frameworks that actually do work for you as a decision maker. And every time I have conversations with ethicists, the questions get more complex and more difficult and more interesting, but I don't feel like we make progress toward concretely figuring out a framework for making a decision. And the experience that I had at Facebook, and this is what I try to convey to my students, is that a lot of decision making is really about identifying benefits, identifying costs, and then feeling comfortable with the costs of whatever decision you make. Because I think most decisions actually are not cost-free. There are very few cost-free decisions. Especially for tech platform stuff, almost all the decisions have costs, and hard costs, like costs that are uncomfortable to have to bear. And the thing that I have tried to convey is that being a decision maker is really about wrestling with those costs and benefits and doing deep analysis, and then figuring out which costs you feel comfortable with, and marching forward, knowing that there are parts of your decision that are not optimal, that impose costs.
Great. Well, you just answered my last question, because as you were talking about how to make decisions, I really want to know how to make decisions, because I think that that's hard. And I think it's the gray area decisions is what you're talking about, where it's not black and white. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong. Those can be hard. But I do think I'd like to open it up to other questions among the audience. If anybody has any questions, let's just open it up. And if not, I'm always full of questions. Oh, here we go. Here's one. Oh, wow. That's a long question. I don't want to read it. Do you mind asking it, or I guess Matt can read it?
Amy, I can do that. That was my question. So I don't know if this is quite related to Section 230, but in an interview I was listening to with Tristan Harris recently, he was talking about, the town square that is Facebook. And when you say town square, it implies sort of a politically neutral space where conversations can happen. But he was, my understanding of the difficulty is not advanced, I'll say that. But what I got from his interview was that the artificial intelligence that Facebook and companies like that use to elevate certain posts and bring them to a wider audience, they sort of tend to prioritize posts with the most interaction, which is inadvertently prioritizing more extreme, more vitriolic posts, which some say is leading to more polarization, in the community. I don't know if you can police this. I don't know if you can regulate it, but if a company like Facebook refuses to take that sort of function away from its platform, if it doesn't do anything about the inadvertent polarization that it's creating, is that a place for policy to jump in and just for public safety?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So a few different components. So I don't think Facebook has ever purported to be truly neutral. And actually Section 230 permits platforms to not be neutral. So I think I don't know of any tech platform actually that actually has a content moderation philosophy of neutrality. Most tech companies have some vision for how they want to moderate content and the kind of product they're trying to have and the kind of the vision that they're trying to project in the world about what they're trying to achieve as a company. So I don't think any of them are neutral. I also don't think that the characterization that what Facebook's algorithm is primarily doing is prioritizing posts that have the most interaction or the most extreme and vitriolic. Facebook actually in, I think, the spring of 2018 made a change that it referred to as meaningful social interactions, which was literally shifting how its newsfeed prioritized content to try to orient it around what people found to be meaningful. So actually reducing the likelihood that you would see kind of spammy content that meant that you weren't having a good experience on the platform, that just seemed extreme or provocative, and they were trying to go more in the direction of meaningfulness. I think that change may have had negative effects as well as positive ones. News organizations were frustrated because it led to a reduction in distribution of their content because the pivot was toward more friends and family content and away from pages content. So I'm not saying it's necessarily entirely positive, but the intent of that was actually to try to address the kind of issue that you're talking about, which was try to promote more meaningful interactions and less extreme and vitriolic posts. That doesn't mean that virality always is in positive directions. So I think there's lots of viral content that can be problematic. It just sort of goes back to what I said at the outset. Like there was lots of Black Lives Matter content that was distributed through viral means, and the virality was really important to having that content get more visibility. There's lots of positive, and I guess I should be more politically neutral about it. I'm saying that as because I think of that as positive content in the world. The viral distribution mechanisms result in virality for bad things and virality for good things. The challenge for policymakers and for product managers is figuring out what are the tools that we could use to get more good and less bad. And that's really hard to parse things in that way.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to hear from other people if you have questions. And I love this, just popping in and asking your question live if you'd like, or you can type it in the chat.
Amy, I have a question. I think my hand's kind of hidden by my background there, but I did have my hand raised. I was curious, Matt, you were kind of towing the line a little bit with Facebook and saying your experience, was different from the whistleblower's experience, and what you saw there was not necessarily reflective of. And I'm curious your take on Facebook as far as, their business plan is to get people to look at Facebook as much as possible. The more time that you're looking at Facebook, the more advertisement money that they can get there, which makes sense, certainly from a business standpoint. And I'm curious, there's studies coming out that are showing that they're really targeting children and young people and trying to get them to be staring at their phone or at Facebook rather, as much as possible. And they're looking at kid groups, getting kids together and trying to get them on messaging and things along those lines. And there's plenty of studies showing that the more that these kids are staring at Facebook, the more social anxiety that they're having to actually interact in person and, more self-conscious they're becoming and things along those lines. And I'm curious if Facebook is, I'm sure Facebook is aware of that information, certainly. And I think that kind of goes back to, is Facebook making the decision for profit versus the good of people? And so I'm curious on your take there of them understanding that them getting children to look at Facebook more is hindering their social abilities and their self-conscious what kind of your thoughts there are on Facebook deciding, well, we're not concerned about that as much as we're concerned about.
Yeah, I think that just really oversimplifies it. I mean, I think that I have found in these discussions that it's very easy for people to say Facebook's not acting intelligently or it's not acting morally. People in academia say that all the time, and people in academia often say it, I think, because they feel more intelligent and they feel more moral. I think that simplifies problems that are very complicated. So I mean, again, I never was part of decisions where it was like, we could do a harmful thing that would be awful in the world, but we'd make a ton of money, or we could do the right thing and we'd lose money. I just wasn't part of those kinds of where the fork in the road was that clear. I don't know exactly what research you're referring to, but a few things. First of all, I don't think Facebook's business model is just try to get people on the platform and have them have a miserable experience and feel okay about that.
Certainly not miserable, no.
I mean, the Facebook will not, like, it recognizes that it cannot survive in the long run if people are having a negative experience on the platform. So just trying to optimize for some short-term thing where some 15-year-old is going to spend 20 hours on their phone on Facebook on a Saturday, and that will have a negative experience for them is not.
No, not at all. My point is not that it's negative. It's that it's more time on Facebook. And certainly Facebook wants that time to be positive. I mean, they want everybody to like this.
That's what you're describing now, I think, is competition. So Facebook should be competing aggressively to want to have people use its service and have a positive experience on the service. I think that's positive. That's good competition. That tends to be when people say that there are antitrust problems in the tech market right now, what you're describing would be a positive antitrust outcome, which is companies competing really aggressively to have people use their product and have them spend time on it. There's this whole mantra now about surveillance capitalism, and I understand some of the components of why people find it to be frustrating, but the idea of capturing people's attention and using that to sell ads is not new. That's what TVs do. That's what newspapers do. Newspapers, just like tech platforms, try to bring people in at a lower cost, although you pay for a newspaper, but bring people in at a somewhat subsidized cost and sell advertising on the backside. The advertising subsidizes the subscription price. So it's not, I don't think it's that explosively new. I haven't seen the data that you're describing, but as I said about the Wall Street Journal data, it's mixed. And so this is, again, why I find that that for me, the question is, what do you do? What are the best steps forward when you get data showing something like 20% of people report feeling worse after using a product and 41% report feeling better? I don't think that's like an easy kind of ethical decision. I don't think it's an easy product decision. I don't think it's an easy policy decision. That's really difficult. My understanding, based on like what Facebook said in its testimony, is that it's trying to develop product solutions that will address that 20% while preserving as much of the 41% as possible. But that's very difficult to achieve in practice. I think it will always be the case, given the nature of what those platforms are, user-generated content platforms, that there will be some number of people who have negative experiences.
So Matt,
really good
it
example.
looks like
I appreciate you pointing that out. And I think that does make sense on the negative point. And I appreciate you pointing out the competition aspect there. I think that makes a lot of sense as well. I am curious, though, kind of where that was coming from is from the social dilemma, which I'm sure you're familiar with and have probably seen. Do you sort of disagree with a lot of the concepts from that film, that it is sort of competition based versus them deliberately trying to go after profit?
So I did a podcast with the director of it, Jeff Orlowski, who is awesome. I mean, I think he's fantastic. If you're curious about the conversation, you should listen to that podcast episode. I watched the film expecting to really dislike it, and I actually liked it a lot. I really like Tristan Harris. I think he's a good messenger for the issues that he gives voice to. And I thought it raised a lot of important points. My main disagreement is the framing of the film was really around how a company is controlling you and you have no agency around how you set up your relationship to technology. And I think the question of how we architect our relationship to technology is a really important one. When we can displace that responsibility to a company that's off in the distance and say, I'm addicted to my phone, that's someone else's fault, it's not mine, I think we actually get further from the conversation about healthy lifestyles with technology that's most productive. I've had so many conversations with people where they say, I hate Facebook, I hate social media, I hate tech, And I say, where's your phone when you go to sleep? And they say, right by my head. And I say, when you go out to dinner with your favorite person in the world, where's your phone? And they say, on the table. Those things are disconsonant. Like, we need, I think, better ways to think about our relationship to devices that make us happier. I thought the social dilemma raised those issues in a helpful way, but suggested the solutions as like in Washington, as opposed to inside yourself in terms of thinking about what are the kinds of relationships that I want to have with technology and how can I do that? I used to work at Facebook, and one of the best things I did toward the end of my time there is I decided to take, and I'm Jewish, I decided to do a version of a technology Sabbath. And so every Friday at 3:00, I would step away from my desk and often turn my phone off. And I've actually enhanced that in some ways. It's like evolved over time. But now I try to actually turn my phone 100% off at 4 p.m. on a Friday and turn it back on at 4 p.m. on Saturday. I don't think there are that many people that do that. And there are people who rage about how awful tech companies are, and then they don't ever create distance with their devices. And I think that I think it's an important thing to think about for everyone to kind of develop what they think are healthy relationships with their technology.
Matt, it looks like we have one last question if we have time, and then I think we wanted to wrap up. Is it Danielle?
Danielle, do you have a quick one?
Well, I can't resist Matt and Amy. Rotary has a 4-way test. It's our test for ethics. And it goes like this. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And what I've discovered in the peace building work that Rotarians do in our community and around the world, that sometimes they use the 4-way test with slightly other words. Is it true? Is it constructive? Is it necessary? Is it inspiring? Is it bridge building? So we know from Oregon Ethics in Business that companies can use the 4-way test to make ethical decisions. And I think you pointed out that besides ethics, there are other decisions along the way that Reed also just recapped for us. But I put that on the table for you to think about as a way to look at ethical decision-making and ethical behavior, whether it's a tech company or any other. And by the way, if you said you're at UNC, as in University of North Carolina?
Yep.
Okay, UNC Duke has a Rotary Peace Center there. And we send folks from around the world. And some of what they get to look at is ethics.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for your time. And I think Reed just wanted to close with a few things, but we appreciate everybody being here today.
Thanks for listening to the PR Talk podcast. Find Amy's book, A Modern Guide to Public Relations, plus more PR Talk episodes at prtalk.co. And remember to subscribe, rate, and review.